Wow, we got a big group here. My name is Jeff Fritz. I'm a program manager on the .NET team. I focus on .NET community. I also do a lot of work with ASP.NET on .NET Framework. That means I'm responsible for things like web forms. Everybody loves web forms. Nobody's raising their hand. For the record, this is on Channel 9, streaming live to the world. Hello! That also means you're going to be able to watch this recorded at some point in the future. Hello, future people. And they're all going to know how much you folks don't like web forms, and you're going to regret it. All right? So let's talk about .NET Core 2.0. We just had a preview release announced and published. And let's review a little bit where we are at this point. We have these three .NET framework flavors, right? Distinct versions. We have the .NET framework on the left. That's the framework that we know and love and we've been using for 15 years on Windows only. We're on .NET Framework version 4.7. If you want to hear more about .NET Framework 4.7, we'll be talking about that at about 2, 3 o'clock here in this room. And on the right, we have Xamarin, right? That's our .NET framework that's built explicitly for building things for mobile platforms and other platforms with some interesting needs like PlayStation, right? You could build things for Mac OS using Xamarin as well. And then in the middle, we have .NET Core, and that's where we're going to focus today. We're going to talk about how we can use .NET Core to build those cross-platform applications that are mostly server-side, ASP.NET Core, services that you may want to build that are headless, console applications, that type of thing that you want to make sure run on Mac, Linux, and Windows. And of course, it doesn't matter which .NET you choose, you're going to get the same compilers, languages, and runtime component support. We're actually going to talk a little bit about languages today. So we know this is .NET Core 2.0 that we're talking about. When we released .NET Core 1.0, we had a series of benefits that we thought were amazing. It was completely open source. You could go out to GitHub, you could see the source code, you could touch it, you could submit pull requests, and for folks who are working for an MVP or they wanted to get some credentials on their resume, to have some pull requests that got accepted into .NET Core was a very cool thing, right? I mean, you can put on your resume, yeah, I wrote feature X, and it's now part of .NET Core. And you go to apply for a job, and they know you contributed to .NET Core. That's a big thing. But we also decided to put together this thing in .NET Core 1.0 where every reference is a package. No longer would you be going through the add reference dialog and finding some loose DLLs on disk or some DLLs that are registered in the global assembly cache. You could add packages that automatically unzipped and had all the information needed no matter what platform you were targeting with .NET Core. This also meant it was very easy for us as maintainers to update .NET Core. We didn't have to wait for a new version of Visual Studio or Patch Tuesday for Windows or even a new version of Windows to publish a new version of .NET Framework. In fact, if you installed the Windows 10 Creators Update Edition, that was released here March, April timeframe, you got a new version of .NET Framework installed with your Windows 10 install, and that's .NET Framework 4.7. At the same time, we released some tooling updates for Visual Studio so that you could target .NET Framework 4.7. Now, I told you that to tell you this. .NET Framework 4.7, for some teams, we were pretty well baked in the January, February timeframe, but we had to wait to make sure that it came out with a version of Windows and everything was synced up with our tooling. We don't want to give you a disconnected experience where tools and operating system and the framework don't work together. So we got to make sure everything gets delivered at once when we deliver .NET Framework. But with .NET Core, everything's a package. We have fine-grained control. We can release updated versions, patched versions of anything that's in the .NET Core framework. And in order to give you a little bit more control over that transitive capability, over those packages, we gave you transitive resolution of packages. So you could refer to the topmost package in the stack, and anything that depended on would automatically be added for you into your project. You don't have to maintain those. You don't see that code in your CS proj file. It just gets added and just works. And then we gave you a command line first software development kit. You type .NET at the command line, and you can start working with building, running your applications quickly and easily. And we built all of our user interface, all of our developer tools that had a user interface on top of that command line so that everybody got the exact same experience. There was no simple and tricky Microsoft backdoor that we were using so we could use feature X, right? Everybody has the same experience and the same opportunity to use the .NET tools. But with a 1.0 version, there's always some challenges. This might actually look a little bit familiar here when I flip back and forth between these two slides. Everybody sees every commit that we put into GitHub. And that presented some challenges because some folks would see some things that we were in the middle of developing, and they would ask questions, and they would get concerned, and we're not fully done developing things, and we would run into some questions that we'd have to resolve when we weren't ready to fully publish. Here's the full new version of .NET Core. Since every reference is a package, well, now we've got to maintain this compatibility graph between all of our packages, and that gets a little bit tricky and dicey when you start to break APIs. How do we maintain that? How do you know that this package is compatible with that one? You've got this list of files you have to maintain and this compatibility array that you need to look at, and that gets really nasty to handle. And that command line first SDK, when you start to install multiple copies of it, well, which one am I using? I want to be able to run multiple versions of the .NET Core framework side by side. I need to be able to redirect and point appropriately at the tools that I want to use when I'm ready to use them. So I need to maintain my version there. And then this last one is the one that really crept up on us, and we said, oh, we got to really address that one. How do we handle compatibility with .NET Framework? Folks have 15 years of investments into .NET Framework assets, DLLs, class libraries, projects, millions of projects, lines of source code in the trillions hanging out there. How do we maintain that investment without throwing out the baby with the bathwater here and get into .NET Core? We want to make sure that you have a smooth experience, an excellent experience getting into .NET Core so that you can take advantage of all the new things that we have available for you there, like performance, right? The cross-platform capabilities. So how do we start to address these challenges? What are the things that we needed to do in order to give you a better .NET Core so that you're ready to go, you're ready to adopt our new framework and move on, start using new features? So we released .NET Core 2.0 Preview 1. This was about 2 weeks ago. It's still open source. So we're still working with that model. We've still got some great things that we're doing there and still publishing everything out to GitHub. That's something we're going to stick to and you're going to be able to access. We're now implementing something called .NET Standard 2.0. And if you saw Scott's keynote this morning, you saw a little bit about how .NET Standard is this contract between all of our APIs and the runtimes that you get to use on each system that you want to run .NET on. But with the 2.0 version of .NET Standard, we enhanced compatibility with the .NET Framework. We want to make sure that you can bring that core business logic, those key pieces of code that you've written over the past 10, 15 years, lift them and run them with .NET Core, with .NET Standard, wherever you need a .NET. So we also brought a broader API surface. And we also allowed you with ASP.NET Core, where we started to see folks who were building web applications and having dozens of packages that they were referencing. They were all really Microsoft packages. We gave you a way to reference one package, and we'll bring in all the most common features for you in ASP.NET. And finally, we made the CLI backwards compatible with a way for you to turn on and off the appropriate features that you want. So let's start with the CLI, and let's take a look at the new .NET Core 2.0 CLI and how we can work with that in our projects, get things started. So I'm just going to go to a command line, and I'm going to go to my dev folder. Let's make a new folder here. We'll call it DEVintersection 2017. Okay? So now, if I run .NET version, you see that I'm running the 2.0 Preview 1 5977. This is the version that's available for you to install right now from .net. Okay, if you go there and you go under .NET Core, and there's a preview area you can enter, you'll find the install for .NET Core 2.0. So I have this version installed, and if I just run .NET, where is it? If I do that, there we go. It starts to show me a little bit more information about exactly what I can do with my .NET command line. You can see there's new things that I can do here, like modify solution files, add, remove, and list my items in the projects, NuGet, MS Build, and VS Test. We can run Visual Studio testing right here from the command line. But I'm going to run .NET New, and without submitting any commands, I get a list of templates that are available here for me. Now, I've already added some extra templates into my list here, but these are all really the project templates that you would get in Visual Studio. And I've also added in, no, it's not in this list of templates. Oh, good. Okay. I was going to say, I thought I added in my SPA templates onto this one, but this machine doesn't have that. So I can start building my projects here on the command line quickly and easily. So if I say .NET New MVC, it's going to spin up a brand new MVC application, and it's immediately running .NET Restore. We know you don't want to start up a new application and not install NuGet packages. There's no reason to start an application without your package references. So let's just run it right away, because everybody runs .NET Restore right after you run .NET New. We do the exact same thing in Visual Studio. When you say File New Project, we restore the packages appropriately for that project. So let's just cut the chase and get right to it. So if we take a look here, you see it looks just like a normal .NET application. I've got Bower configuration, app settings configuration, bundle config, so I can bundle up my my static resources. I've got a www root folder here with some JavaScript libraries copied in directly for me. And of course, I've got simple controllers and views. So of course, I can just do a simple .NET run, and it's going to build this, and the web server will start, and I will be able to browse to it. Fine. We're used to seeing that, and this is all the .NET Core 2.0 stuff, but this is backwards compatible. How do I trigger the backwards compatibility for this? So what I'm going to do, let's start a new project here. We'll call this DEVintersection 1.0. Yep, that one. And I actually have, sitting up here on the root, a global JSON. Now, copy that here. And I'm going to rename it. Let's just do this. So you can see, I'm going to just rename this file. Yep. Now, if you look at this JSON file, I'm going to open it in Visual Studio Code because I don't want you to think that I'm doing anything different with Visual Studio here. So I've got a JSON file that has, in particular here, SDK version 103. I'm forcing global JSON to say, this is the version of the SDK that I want to use. Now, those SDK versions that I can choose are actually sitting in cprogramfiles.net. Okay? So when I look at this folder, come here, you. This is where my .NET SDK lives, okay? There's .NET EXE, and that .NET EXE is actually a lie. That's the one that you call every time you run .NET, but it actually routes to one that's living under the SDK folder. And I've got 3 SDKs installed on this machine, because I rebuilt it recently, and I lost all my other previews and things, so I got down to just a couple that I really want to show. I've got 103, 104, and the 2.0 preview. The actual .NET command line is under here, and it's right there. See, .NET DLL. So depending on the SDK version that you have installed and you reference in global JSON, it will come down and find the appropriate DLL in that version folder and actually boot up and use that when you call .NET. Now, if you don't have a global JSON specified, it'll just go find whatever the largest version is and use that one. So by default, I didn't have anything installed. It ran .NET 2.0 preview. I'm going to come back over here and zoom out. So I have this global JSON here. So now if I say .NET version, now it says it's 103. So this is how you can put things down and work side by side in different versions of the .NET SDK on your machine. So you shouldn't have any concerns about using the .NET Core 2.0 SDK and libraries on a machine that already has .NET Core 1.0. You can have them live side by side, and they don't interfere with each other at all. Completely isolated folders, all right? So in fact, what I've heard some folks do is they'll put a global JSON at the root of their dev folder or whatever your software development project folder is, and they'll put in there, here's the version that I want to work with. They'll put 103 in that global JSON right at the top. And then they might have an experimental folder over here where they're actually tinkering, and they'll put a different global JSON in there that says the 2.0. This way, they are explicitly turning on the experimental features, the preview features that are in the 2.0 SDK. So you can keep those two tracks running separately and independently of each other. So even though I'm in the .NET 1.0 SDK now, if I do .NET new, well, let me show you. I should have, so I've got a much smaller list of templates here. So now let me do .NET new MVC. So the exact same command. It did not restore my packages. But let me do more on my CS proj. You see its target framework is .NET Core App 1.1. If I look at this one, it's .NET Core App 2.0. So it's generated the template appropriately for the appropriate framework that's preferred by the SDK that I was using. So a lot more sensibility, a lot of things that you can do with the SDK there to bounce back and forth between the different versions. All right. There we go. Didn't refresh on my machine. So this brings us to the next point, the .NET Standard Library. And we've shown this diagram a couple times where we've got the one library to rule them all. One of my colleagues has read just a little bit too much Tolkien and got a little carried away, but that's okay. We'll forgive them. So we want to give you this one contract, this one API level that you can target that will just work no matter which one of the .NETs you're using. So one library to rule them all, you learn one API specification, reuse your code across the .NET platforms. We'll actually, as part of the compile process, type forward appropriately if there needs to be a change to the target framework that the host project is using. So if you're building a Xamarin application here on the right, we'll do the appropriate type forwarding to those APIs that you need and you're trying to target even though you've been using the .NET Standard language or API set. This also means there's less to be maintained for each framework runtime because they can all focus and say, well, I'm specifying .NET Standard, here's the way that we maintain things to become a .NET Standard framework. So there's two major problems that .NET Standard solves over the old PCL way that we did things, right? Portable class libraries, some folks refer to these as pickles. Pickles? Anybody call PCLs pickles? I think it's the same folks that call NuGet packages nupkegs. They call them pickles. So the PCLs didn't scale for the future. You had very explicit framework versions that were specified in the definition of what your portable class library was. That also made it very hard to understand the relationships between different implementations, different portable class library choices of frameworks that you would use. Does this DLL appropriately work inside that project? It was hard to tell. You had to actually go through and examine. Versus with .NET Standard, I know that I'm using 1.0, 1.2, 1.6, and there's a very explicit list of frameworks that adhere to that. But it's abstracted. I'm referring to a .NET Standard version. So if a new .NET were to come along, right? If I were to start my own software company, Fritz's software company, and I invented the IoT rock, and you want to run .NET on my IoT rock because everybody wants to know exactly what their pet rock is doing because it has a USB cable sticking out the back of it. I can specify that my rock adheres to .NET Standard 1.2, and I can still use the same HTTP client to connect to my IoT rock and check to see if it's wet or if it's sitting in dirt or all those things that you want to know about your pet rock, because I'm going to make the IoT rock a thing. And I mean, it's like a throwback to the 70s and the pet rock. It's going to come back. I'm going to make it a thing. So as you talk about the smaller versions of .NET Standard, 1.0 is the smallest version number. It is a very small API surface. But all frameworks that specify they belong to 1.0, they all implement that entire API. And then as you go further out in these concentric circles, they implement all the features of the lower versions, all of those API features, and some more, but they lose versions of .NET Framework that they support. Let me show you. I have, where is it? Here. Let's open up a browser. And let's go to github.com/.NET/standard. So there's documentation here that I want you to see. So this is under docs, versions. So here's that same grid that we saw on the Microsoft docs, if you browse to and search through there. Now, you can see all of the APIs that are supported by these different versions by actually clicking through on the hyperlinked version numbers up top. And this is all GitHub documentation, so it actually bounces back and forth through different assets on GitHub, and you can see exactly which platforms it supports. Right? And hopefully one day Fritz's IoT rock will appear in this list, but that's something that I can opt into without Microsoft having to approve or say, you know, we are granting access to this platform. It just works. So I can actually click through to the APIs here, and it'll show me the list of APIs. Everything that is supported inside this version of .NET Framework. And this is a huge list. And it goes on and on. You can see the scroll bar on the right, okay? So if there's something you really want to search for and see in the source code, it's here. And now you know what Microsoft interns have been doing for the last 6 months. They've been updating these things. We've got a script that does that, but somebody wrote the script, though. So that's one place that you can see these APIs, and you can see, right, you can see here the new items that are added to each version of the APIs as I go through this list. All right, so here's 1.4, and we've lost a couple versions of the framework, but we gained System I/O features, and we gained reflection features as we went into .NET Standard 1.5. But in addition to seeing things on the Microsoft docs, I want to show you APIs of .NET. And this is a great website that was written by a developer. You could tell it was written by a developer because it's in standard, simple, bootstrap default template. No designers involved here, no marketing involved. This is the bare minimum, just what you need about .NET, straight from a developer, with almost 500,000 APIs indexed as of May 16th. And you can browse and search for APIs specifically here, like system.data.dataset, because I am nothing if not old. There it is, system data dataset. And it will show you all kinds of information about when it was first made available, .NET Framework 1.1, and then the different versions of .NET Frameworks that this API is available to you in. So .NET Core 2.0, it's available as part of this expanded API set that we're releasing in .NET Core. It's also available as part of .NET Standard 2 and available in Mono. So you can run this on your favorite Linux distro, you can run it on your favorite IoT device that supports Mono. You can use a data set. So we've got this tremendous set of documentation and assets that you can look at and now start working with to build .NET Core resources. Back to the slides. So when we announced .NET Standard 2.0 to go with .NET Core 2.0, we made a big deal that we added up to 20,000 new APIs. Those are properties, those are methods, those are classes that were added to .NET Standard between 1.6 and 2.0. That's almost double the amount of APIs that are available to you. And the second item here, this is where the rubber meets the road. You can now reference .NET Framework libraries directly. So that business logic that Skippy, who used to sit next to you back in 2010, wrote, and then he checked it into your Subversion repository, and then something happened and your Subversion source code got lost in a move or something, and you just have the DLLs laying around now, that's okay. You can reference those DLLs directly from your .NET Standard application, .NET Standard libraries, and then reference them in your .NET Core applications, and they'll just work. Now, there are some caveats there. Of course, we want to make sure that you know if you reference things that are Windows specific, if you reference things that are platform specific, a P invoke, they won't work. If you reference things that aren't part of .NET Standard, they won't necessarily work in the next .NET Core environment that you try and promote to, okay? So registry, I'm sorry, does not exist on an iOS device. So if you try and access the registry, you're going to get an error. That kind of makes sense. You kind of expect that. But because we can access the NuGet.org open source repository of packages, and we can download those and test some things, we found that more than 70% of the packages that are available on NuGet.org work if you were to make them .NET Standard packages instead of .NET whatever version, okay? So those other packages that don't work, there's some pretty specific things in there, like maybe WinForms controls, WPF controls, or UI components, right? Different things to help you instrument Windows, or Xamarin tools that are appropriate for that framework. So those framework-specific things aren't going to work as well with .NET Standard. They probably won't make it over into .NET Standard 2. And the API list that we added to .NET Standard 2, it's a pretty good list of things that we added here. A lot of folks were asking for help with mail, right? They want to send mail from their application servers, from the web servers. So we brought mail back into .NET Standard and consequently .NET Core. Compression, you can do compression now natively with .NET Standard with .NET Core, right? That system I/O compression namespace that we waited for in, I think it was .NET Framework 4 or 3.5, is now available for you natively everywhere. And XML, because all the cool kids who are 35 years and older love XML and angle brackets that go along with it. Because everybody else started going to curly braces, right? We need to use JSON instead of XML now. But you probably have a lot of things that are still out there using XML. Well, that's great. We support XSL. Everybody loves XSL? For the record, nobody's raising their hand again, okay? Folks on Channel 9, nobody's raising their hand about XSL. I love XSL. That was one of my first jobs, was writing XSL style sheets on top of XML. Tremendous experience, and it made me the grumpy developer that I am today. Binary formatting for serialization, threading. Threading's really tricky when you're not on Windows. But now we abstract that away for you, and if you build with .NET Core, and you target and start working with threads and thread pool, it doesn't matter if you're on Mac, Linux, or Windows, it just works. You can manage your threads directly. And I'm old school. I like to manage my threads directly instead of await a sync sometimes. I like to give me a new thread. I want to start and manage that thing. So our .NET Standard version rules. It's always additive, right? I showed you it's this onion model, right? The smallest 1.0 version is all the way in the middle, and as we add and define new versions of .NET Standard, it includes all the APIs that are inside of the onion layer, okay? It's also immutable. Once shipped, a .NET Standard version is frozen. Now, to be clear, we're looking at .NET Standard version 2 preview. So we're still working on it. There might be some changes, some additional APIs that are added into the mix. But once we lock that down, Your kids are going to get the same version of .NET Standard 2 when they start programming, what, next week, next month? Your kids should be programming this stuff any day now. We want to see a lot more folks get involved with .NET. So when you build your .NET Standard libraries, you have these options with .NET Standard 1. If you're .NET Framework, if you're .NET Core, if you're Xamarin, you can reference a .NET Standard 1-point-something library that targets either another .NET Standard library that is the same .NET Standard version or lower, because we're maintaining those concentric rings, or a portable class library that is appropriately portable with that platform. Now, when we talk about 2.0, we bring in this little arm of the display here, of the diagram, where you can now reference .NET Framework libraries directly. And this is where Scott showed us this diagram, where it gets kind of crazy when you're referencing .NET Framework libraries. Since .NET Core is an implementation of .NET Standard, we try to keep things separate. We want to make sure that .NET Core and .NET Standard kind of have a Chinese wall in between them, right? We don't want one influencing the other directly, right? We don't want the same people working on both things because we want .NET Standard to evolve and to be something that takes the best of all three frameworks. Where .NET Core wants to be an implementation of .NET Standard, the reference implementation of .NET Standard, so it's real easy for Core to evolve and bring in those features that are appropriate for .NET Standard, that everybody needs. So, .NET Standard updates are coordinated. They can be coordinated across the .NET Standard Review Board and the .NET Foundation Technical Steering Committee. So we have a third-party foundation, a nonprofit, that helps to manage and work with some of the other vendors that are building and implementing .NET on various platforms. We want to make sure that those people have a voice and they can see and work with .NET as it's being evolved. Consequently, since .NET Core is that reference implementation, we can continue to evolve that implementation separate from .NET Standard, so we can experiment, innovate, figure out if there's new ways that we want to do things. So let's take a look at building a .NET Standard library. We're going to go real simple to start, and then I'll show you how we bring in that shim so we can use a .NET Framework library that's really old, and from 2010, in fact. So let's end this, close this one, that one, don't need that anymore. All right. So let's go find, here it is. So I'm using Visual Studio 2017 Enterprise. Enterprise is a paid SKU. There is a community version that you can download and use if you're a hobbyist, if you're in school. There's a couple other rules around who can use it, but if you're in school or if you're toying with .NET as a hobby, you can download and install the community edition of Visual Studio for free. So this is a simple .NET Standard library here, and you can see I've set this up. It is using .NET Standard 1.4. And all I have in here is a network client that's going to run out to request bin and return. It's using HTTP client, and I have a console app here using .NET Core 1, and it's going to create a new network test. So I've taken all my network client information with an HTTP client, and I've pushed it into this library. So if you have some sort of a service that you're exposing and you want to expose a client API that you want everybody to use, it's a great idea to put that type of client inside of a .NET Standard library so that everybody gets that same client API and you're not recompiling for 5 or 6 different platforms. You publish it once as .NET Standard and it just works everywhere. So in this case, I've just written this very simple HTTP client GET, and it's going to do a write line of the message and then read it out at the end. There was a Star Wars sound effect that went off there. So there you go. It ran out there. It's giving me a 404 because my API endpoint expired. That's okay. You can see it just wrote out, here's the information that it went to. Now, what I want to show you is, because this is a .NET Standard 1.4, if I come over here and change this, 1.4 supports a bunch of different frameworks. If I change this to 1.0, and I'm changing it specifically to 1.0, and if I do a rebuild on this, I'm going to do a clean first, and then I'm going to do a rebuild. There we go. So it's just done a restore, and see, rebuild all failed, and this is because HTTP client does not exist as part of the 1.0 specification. The 1.0 goes all the way back and supports things like Windows Phone 8, Windows 8 applications, where HTTP client doesn't really exist. The first version of the HTTP client appears is actually in .NET Standard 1.1. So you get a nice error message if you're trying to use APIs that don't exist in that version of .NET Standard. So that's kind of handy to see that. So if I change this just to 1.1, save, and rebuild, restore completed, and it succeeds, okay? So you can use that back and forth between different versions and reference and use .NET Standard easily. So now let's take a look at that other sample where we're actually going to reference where is it? It's not in this version of Visual Studio. I'm going to go to the preview. I don't see it there. So this is Visual Studio Preview. Let's open this, and we're going to go to, it is called Sample Zip. And if you're in the keynote this morning, you saw this demo, but I want to dig into it just a little bit further. What we've done here is we've taken the business logic from the sharp ziplib library, right? And if you haven't seen it in about 10 years, this is sharp ziplib. It's from IC Sharp Code. This hasn't been touched. 2012 was the last time they touched the website. The actual DLL hasn't been touched since 2010. And when you open up and look at the contents of the DLL, it's all 2.0 stuff. So if you had a complex logic DLL like this that is all .NET, you can grab that, reference it inside your .NET Standard library here. And this is my .NET Standard library that you saw called Compressor. This is a .NET Standard 2.0 library. There it is. And it's referencing that zip library directly. Now, when you use .NET Standard with .NET Core and you take a dependency here on the SDK, it's .NET Core App, and .NET Core App just implements .NET Standard. So there's nothing to see in here that says .NET Standard. However, for .NET Framework, like this application, this console application that also references, right? So we've got all those references. There's my Compressor 2 library. There's my zip library. But see all these things up here? It's referencing from packages, right? Remember with .NET Framework 4.7 and earlier, we've actually got to reach down into the packages folder where all of our NuGet packages live. And you have to, for right now, as part of the preview, you have to install a .NET Standard shim that will give you access to those same APIs inside of your .NET Framework project. Now the goal is, before we fully finish and release .NET Standard, you won't have to install this shim. It'll just work with your .NET Framework projects. So I have this library sitting here, and that's great. You may have seen we were able to build and run this using my referenced DLL with no problems here. Restore completed very quickly. Let me open up the command prompt. I'm going to go down into dev sample zip. There we go. And this is in core console. Yep, that one. And let me go to bin, debug. Yeah, there it is. So now I can run my application, right? So if I say .NET, .NET Core Console to app, console2 app DLL, and it's going to zip up and just drop a file here that has a compressed set of contents. Where is it? There's not there. There it is, zip files. Okay? So I zipped and it didn't find any files to put in here, but it would have found files and put it inside that folder. That's nice, but I want to be able to use this somewhere else than just on a Windows machine, right? That's the whole point of using .NET Core. I want to be able to lift and shift and take it somewhere else. So what you can do is you can actually go into your core application here, and if you say edit, you can go drop in a runtime identifiers line here. Okay? Runtime identifiers is a definition of the runtime platforms that you want your .NET Core application to be able to run on. So it's runtime identifiers, plural. The IntelliSense has a runtime identifier, single. But if you're going to list multiple ones of these, you need to use the runtime identifiers, plural. Separate them with a semicolon. And on our docs, on docs.microsoft.com, there's a complete catalog of the runtime identifiers we support. In this case, I've listed Win7 and OS 10 12-x64, otherwise known as Mac OS Sierra. Follow me here. I'm going to right-click on this, and I would say Publish. Now, I've already put together a folder profile here, and if I click Settings, I can choose to publish a complete release version of this for either OS 10, Mac OS, or Windows 7. So I'll get the entire set of DLLs that I need for this, everything from the .NET Core framework that I need to run my application. So if I go back, let me show you the folder here because I've already published it because I don't want to waste time on that. So I already ran the publish. It's down here in core, release, publish output, and there's all these files. Okay, that's everything needed to run a .NET Core application. And in fact, you'll see Core Console App 2 DLL so that we can run it wherever we want to take it. All right. So I've actually taken that and in shared framework mode, where it's only the DLLs that I need and it expects an SDK to be there, I've actually lifted that and put it here on my Mac. Can we switch to display 5, please? There we go. So here we are on my Mac. I know, a Microsoft guy running a Mac, but an actual Mac with Mac OS. Kind of weird. And I'm sitting in my folder here with just those DLLs copied over. And you see there, IC Sharp Code DLL. All right, this is a Windows DLL. It was compiled with .NET Framework 2.0, ran only on Windows, and I've got it here on my Mac. And if you take a look, I do have some samples in my samples folder here. There's a couple of really bad older images of me here. But I'm going to run .NET. Let's do .NET, where is it? Core Console 2 app. Make sure I get that right. Core Console 2 app, DLL. And then I'm going to pass in a folder name to compress. And then where I want to drop it, I will call it zippedfiles.zip. Completed zipping. No errors, nothing. It's just there. So let's check this out. So I'm going to go down into jfritz, dev. Here's my sample zip. There's this folder. And then there's my zip files. If I double click it, it does decompress it, and I can open it. And there's some really bad older pictures of me at TechReady. All right? But it compressed, right? This is a Windows DLL that I brought from Windows 10. I unearthed it from the days of Windows 7, and I brought it over, and it's running on the latest, greatest Mac OS, no code changes. Skippy's long gone, who wrote the original DLL, but it works wherever I need to take my business logic. That's pretty cool stuff. All of your old DLLs, if they use just the managed framework, should just work. Pretty good stuff. So can we go back over to the other display, back to switcher to display 2, please? Thank you. I want to get rid of people seeing those images of me. Dear Lord. All right. So that's a little bit about building a .NET Standard library. Now, I mentioned briefly about languages. This is a big one for me. Visual Basic support is here in .NET Core 2.0 preview. And this is big for me because years ago, the first programming language that I learned, I was just a kid, and my dad taught me BASIC on a Commodore 64. And I've kind of grown with that, and BASIC has always been hanging out there in the background, and that's kind of been the language that I enjoy using. Well, now Visual Basic is available for use with .NET Core. No web templates are available, but you can start writing classes and console applications in VB. Razor's going to stay a C# thing for now, but you can start up and use Visual Basic with .NET Core on the new Visual Studio preview. So let's take a quick look at that. So I'm going to go File, New Project, and here I'm in Visual Basic, .NET Core. I'm going to grab Console App, and we will call this VB Core Console. And check this out. Program VB, it's just a simple console write line. I'm going to add just a console read line here. No, don't do that. All right. Build succeeded, and we have VB running from Visual Studio 2017 preview on the command line with .NET Core. Now, I got to warn you, VB is not in with the CLI yet for .NET Core. It didn't make the cutoff for when we needed to ship that. It is packaged with Visual Studio, so you can compile and run from Visual Studio your Visual Basic applications. At some point in the future, we will get that Visual Basic compiler in there on the CLI so that you can use it wherever you may go without needing to install Visual Studio 2017. But quickly and easily, you can see I have Visual Basic here. I can start using it if I want to build new applications, new console applications to interact with, or even class libraries that are going to be .NET Standard compliant console applications, so you can have something running maybe in a Docker container, do some great business logic. Go ahead now and feel free to with Visual Basic. So where are my Visual Basic developers in the room here? Raise your hands. Okay, once again, okay, so I've got maybe 5–10% of the room. Cool, that's great. I love seeing that because a lot of us learned from Visual Basic. That's where a lot of us started. Some of us didn't grow up and crank out as C# developers or C++ developers, F# developers right away. You got to ramp up sometimes, and VB was, at least for me, my on-ramp to .NET development. So, I am running out of time. I want to make sure I get to one or two more things in here. There we go. Visual Studio has a bunch of tooling updates for you as a .NET Core developer. Live unit testing support. If you have an enterprise version of Visual Studio, you can use live unit testing to get unit tests reported back to you, whether or not they pass or fail, immediately as you're writing code. You don't even have to save code, it just works. And that works now with .NET Core as well. That was a big request we had from the initial release of Visual Studio. Well, now you can do it with .NET Core as well. There was a request for support for multiple TFMs, or target framework monikers. So you saw me use these runtime IDs, Win7 and OSX. Well, there's also target framework monikers you may have seen us use, like Net452 or Net461 or Net Core App 11. Those are target framework monikers. And there was a feature that we displayed in an earlier version of Visual Studio where you could build for multiple frameworks at the same time. You can do that again with the preview version of Visual Studio. You can also specify side-by-side SDKs. So you saw we had the two versions of the SDK sitting there. You can actually tell Visual Studio to work back and forth with those. And the last one, The last one is actually huge for many of us. It's Visual Studio for Mac, okay? Who's using a Mac, but a real Mac with like Mac OS installed, and they didn't do that fake thing where they install Windows on it? Okay, I've got about 40% of the room. That's cool. So now Visual Studio for Mac is available, and you can download that and use that to build .NET Core applications. All the assets, all the same features are over there for you on Visual Studio for Mac. Can we switch back over to display 5, please? Here it comes. You see it bouncing down there at the bottom. And we're looking at that icon for Visual Studio for Mac, and we're saying, how did they get a cooler icon than us on Windows? So it's going to take another second or so here. I've got a small MacBook Air that's running this. But you can very easily come in, new project, .NET Core, choose an app. You can build your console application, your ASP.NET Core libraries. It's all very easy for you to get in and start working with, and you get really the exact same features that you had in Visual Studio. It should all seem very familiar to you and look and feel very much the same as what you're used to when you're working with Visual Studio on Windows. So we've done that purposely so that everybody has this unified common experience. And you can see I've got a Solution Explorer that's opening up here, views, root. It's all exactly the same way that we had it before over in Windows. All right, can we go back to display 2, please? And I'm actually going to jump ahead here a little bit. So the big question is, when are these things going to come out? So we saw .NET Core 1.0 was released last June. .NET Core 1.1 we iterated on and we came out with about 4 months later in October. And we started talking about .NET Standard 2.0 here in the spring, some initial releases, and we're looking at releasing .NET Core 2.0, .NET Standard. On our roadmap, we have this pegged for a Q3 release. Now, of course, if you're a developer, you know that Q3 means August 30th, 2017, because that is the last day of Q3, because you want to get everything in there and working. And if you're in marketing, of course, you know Q3 means June 1st, 2017, right? Yeah. Look, I'd be happy if it came out somewhere in the middle. Give me a July. Give me a early August. So that's what we have pegged for when you're going to be able to get full RTM versions of this. But it is available in preview now. I showed you how you can run it side by side. I encourage you to download it, check it out, go to .net/core/preview, and you can go find it, download it, and start using it with your version of Visual Studio, with your version of Visual Studio Code, and start working with these new libraries, with these new features. And I think you're going to have a really good time trying out and getting used to the new .NET Core. So with that, thank you very much. You can reach me on Twitter. I am @C#Fritz. There's my email address if you want to reach out, have any questions. I'll be more than happy to take those. I think we have another couple minutes here in the room if anybody has any questions in the room. For the folks on Channel 9, thanks so much for watching. For the folks who are in the future watching, for the folks watching the recording, let me know who wins the World Series in 2017, okay? I want to place a couple bets.